Greetings. It is I, Queen of Headless, or I guess I'm going to change my name to Headless Queen of Horror. I'm not sure. But today we're going to go over a little something that is an intro to video game analysis, because I realized in some of my series before that I did not include a primer or explain some of the concepts that I was going to talk about. And now that I have a lot more experience doing this kind of thing and experience teaching people these kinds of things, I feel like I'm better equipped to explain myself better and explain what goes into analysis. I'm basing some of this also off of a very old script that I wrote that was for the same purpose, to explain like how you would analyze a video game. So a lot of the examples are going to be about Silent Hill 2, because this originally was going to be basically part 0 of Let's Analyze Silent Hill, but this can be basically about anything. You can use this to analyze video games, you can use this to talk about literature, you can use this to, I don't know, pick apart whatever you want. So a little bit about video game analysis, just as a note, is that this is actually a relatively new field. We've really only been analyzing video games academically for probably the past 20-25 years. Before then, there was a lot of analysis that went into, what makes a game successful, what makes a game fun. But there wasn't really a lot of work out there looking at video games as literature, like analyzing them the way that you would analyze literature in an English class. This is a fact that is well documented, actually. If you look into like actual academic sources where people try to analyze video games, they almost always note that it is a relatively new field, and therefore it's kind of the Wild West out there. There's not a lot on protocol, which is something I'm going to go over a little later, of like one of the major problems that people run into in analyzing video games. So we're kind of forging our own path here. So what is analysis? So we're going to go over some definitions, pop some popcorn, I don't know if you're the kind of person that wants to sit back and watch, or the kind of person that wants to take notes. Regardless, we're going to go over some definitions. So we're going to go over the technical definition and the literary definition of analysis. So the technical definition of analysis is the separation of a whole into its component parts. Pretty easy to understand. You got pancakes, then you have flour, egg, sugar, whatever, like all the component parts, okay? So it's the same as taking apart an engine or even the human body. You have to break something apart to understand the whole and understand how it works. In literature, though, and by extension analyzing video games, there might be disagreement over what the parts even are. Like what do you pick apart and what do you talk about? Or even what matters in, some cases. So the literary definition of analysis is it's sort of the technical definition of analysis, separation of a whole into its component parts. But then it's understanding why those techniques make the work effective. So, for example, like if you're analyzing a horror movie and it's scary, you would talk about like, well, what makes it scary? What parts of it, and beyond just, a jump scare or something. You might look at things like body horror and say, well, it makes us feel weird and like creepy and invasive because, we imagine that happening to our own bodies, right? In order to do this, though, in order to understand how all those individual pieces work together, we have to talk a little bit about what's called intertextuality. So intertextuality was coined in the 1960s by Julia Kristeva. Basically, she says, any text is constructed of a mosaic of quotations. Any text is the absorption and transformation of another. So what does this mean? It just means that anything creative is, and honestly anything technical or sciencey or whatever, is nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything is the sum of everything that came before it. So even if you may say that something didn't influence you, if it's something that's ingrained in culture, it's going to influence you. And so it's important to look at not just the original source, which in the example we're using for this video is Silent Hill 2. You can't just look at the video game in a vacuum, because there are things that came before it, there are ideas that came before it that you have to acknowledge and you have to look at. And then Roland Barthas down here, I don't know how to say his last name, says bits of code, formulae, rhythmic models, fragments of social languages, etc., pass into the text and are redistributed within it, for there is always language before and around the text. So exactly what I just said. There are always things that come before the thing. If you could find, which we're going to go over primary sources later, if you can find the primary source of all primary sources, and nobody say the Bible, don't be a dork, then, kudos to you for the original thing that ever existed, but there's no such thing. So everything that exists has things that came before it. So for example, we might, I think originally I had talked about how what the fog in Gone with the Wind represents versus what the fog in Silent Hill might represent. Now, do I think that Gone with the Wind necessarily directly influenced the people who wrote Silent Hill? No, but it is something that is fog is something that represents, the mysterious, the unknown, and then therefore like what could be lurking in the fog, what's scary. And that could be physical. It could be, like the Stephen King book / movie. Was it Stephen King? Whatever. The Mist, right? It could be something actually physically in the fog. Or it could be something that is more psychological, like in Gone with the Wind and Silent Hill, where it represents things in your mind that you don't want to acknowledge, that you don't want to think about. And so this is something that is it's a universal idea that the fog can represent all these different things. So no, Gone with the Wind did not directly influence Silent Hill, but this is something that you can compare to say, look at these two things that use the same thing and use them in similar ways. So how do you analyze? So this is a super basic crash course. I broke this down as much as I possibly could. So how do we analyze? So to analyze literature, remember that authors could make choices for a reason, intentional or unintentional. Now I want you to reread that sentence. Could make choices, whether they make those choices intentionally or unintentionally, and we're going to go over that. An analysis should point out choices made and attempt to explain their significance. So, for example, the body language that Angela, and forgive me, this is a very old clip that I recorded years ago. For example, in this, Angela, her body language might suggest somebody that is either very self-conscious or just feels very uneasy with her own body, right? And obviously knowing the story, knowing that she was raped by her father, we can look at this and say, well, this is clearly trying to show that, sort of foreshadow that, to say that she's uncomfortable with her body. She doesn't like the way James is walking around her, so she feels she's holding herself almost to comfort herself. Now, they don't say that in the game, and the creators, as far as I know, have not said that that's what they're doing here, right? So what we would have to do is look at academic sources. So you might pull up psychology papers on the way women might act after they've gone through something like that. We might look at other video games where characters have gone through something similar. We might look at other literature or movies where, again, a character has gone through something similar, to explain how we're making that connection of why is Angela acting this way around James. So who do you trust when it comes to sources? Well, this is kind of complicated when it comes to video games. So there's a thing that is called, now my job, part of my job is to define what are reliable sources for something, right? So somebody might come to me and they might say, I need all the current literature on this, right? And so believe me, I literally have like a master's degree in this. So there's a test that we call the CRAP test. And the 5 points that it has to meet is currency, relevancy, authority, accuracy, and purpose. So currency is basically how current is it? How up to date is the information? Now it matters a little bit more when it comes to things like science, fields that evolve really quickly. It doesn't matter as much when in regards to things like literature, especially when we were talking about primary and secondary sources, okay? Now, where currency matters is sometimes an author might say something and then they might come out later and say, well, actually it meant this, right? So that's the most current information, and it's a primary source because we're talking about from the author themselves. But again, currency for literature and video game analysis is a little wiggly because obviously the primary source is the original thing, like the book or the video game. But, you know, if we're talking about a game that was 20 years ago, like that's a long time ago. So relevancy, how relevant is it to the source? You know, you don't want to pull up something about how to brew coffee when we're talking about Silent Hill, unless, I don't know, there's a Keurig in the new Silent Hill. I have no idea. And then authority, this is the one that matters the most, I would say, in regards to analyzing literature and video games, which is the person who's talking to you. What is their background? You know, like, is it somebody that actually worked on Silent Hill? Then their opinion probably matters a little bit more than somebody like me who is just making videos for fun. Like, their opinion has more weight than my opinion. But then if it's somebody that didn't work on the actual material, you might say, okay, well, this guy is a professor of literature at, you know, Brighton University. He probably knows what he's talking about. Like, he probably knows a little bit about analysis. So again, his opinion would weigh more than mine because, you know, I mean, I have a degree, but I don't have a degree in that, you know? So, authority can also apply to something like not just the author of the, let's say like it's an article or something. It doesn't just apply to the author themselves, but also where was it published? So was it published on randompeople.net, or was it published in a peer-reviewed academic journal where their literal peers, like, you know, other researchers had to read it and agree, like, yeah, this is good, thumbs up. You know, that is, so you're not just, when you're looking at a peer-reviewed journal, you're not just looking at the authority of one person. It has the backing of a panel of people. And then accuracy, obviously, is it accurate? You know, if somebody came along and they were like, I think Pyramid Head represents, you know, James's period, I would be like, that's cool. Can you prove that though? You know, and they probably couldn't. So the last one is purpose, and purpose is a little harder to define when it's not super obvious. So if somebody creates something for the intention of, let's say, clickbait, okay? So they make up a wild claim where they're like, in the new Silent Hill 2 remake, James fucks Pyramid Head. And then you know, you're like, whoa, what? So clearly they're claiming this to get more views. They're not claiming it because it's factual or because it's even an inference you can make. Actually, I don't know. I have not played the new Silent Hill yet. It's probably not a great source because it is, they're trying to, I mean, it goes along with trying to sell you something, you know, like that's another purpose to look at is, are they doing this because they're trying to like get something out of it, right? Do they have something to gain from saying whatever they're saying? And if it seems like their intention is only to inform, and sometimes even if they're wrong, like, you know, that still is, they're still checking this box of purpose, right? Purpose also involves the objectivity of the information. So like, is it presented impartially? Does it have a slant or a bias? Could it be fact-based or opinion-based? Okay, so you also would want to look at something. Now this is more if you're actually looking at academic stuff, like you would want to check the affiliations that the authors might have, such as, you know, if a study is released about heart disease that says, hey, guess what? Actually, eating red meat is good for your heart. And then you read the affiliations of the authors and it says that they're from like some cow people from Texas, right? You would be like, okay, I think you might have a bias here. So the next category, this is a little more wiggly when it comes to video games, is primary sources versus secondary sources. So a primary source means it is either the material itself or it's the people who created it. Okay, now again, often we're talking about literature when we're talking about this. So usually it'll just be the book, the author, okay? It gets a little bit more complicated when you're talking about a video game, which we'll go over later. So a secondary source might be things like a textbook analyzing it. It might be a documentary about it. It could be biographies of the creators. It could be critiques or commentaries, things like that. So the line between primary and secondary gets a little weird sometimes because, for example, there is a making of Silent Hill 2 documentary. Okay, so you would think, okay, it's a documentary, it falls under secondary sources. Well, it depends actually on what you're quoting from it, because if you're actually quoting one of the creators, because there's quite a few interviews with the creators sprinkled throughout the documentary, that quote is a primary source because it's coming from one of the creators. But if you're talking about the voiceover that just talks about the process, that kind of summarizes what they did, that's a secondary source because it is not the creators and it's not the original material. Now, this primary sources often gets more involved when you're talking about something historical, because usually it just means something that happened when the thing happened. So like if you're talking about like a war or something, you might say that primary sources might be things like diaries or journals or some kind of like letters and things, or photographs that were taken during the time, right? So or official documents like a birth certificate or something. That's a primary source. So that's why it gets a little wiggly when we're talking about literature and video games. So it should pass, any source should pass the crap test, and you should rely more on primary sources than secondary sources when you can. Sometimes you do and should override what the primary sources say if you can. And I'm going to explain that, what I mean by that. So if somebody says, well, I was never influenced by that, but then you pull up their biography and it says, well, you know, clearly this thing happened to them, right? Then you could probably make the argument that the author is actually wrong and that it did influence them. So what do I mean by this? So, and not that the creators have ever argued that Japanese horror did not influence them. And by Japanese horror, I mean old like ghost stories, like legends and things. So let's say the creators never talked about the influence of Japanese horror or Japanese ghost stories on their creative process, right? So what I might do is I might pull up some text analyzing Japanese ghost stories, okay, like old Japanese ghost stories, and make some parallels to Silent Hill. And then I would also pull up, you know, biographies of the creators showing that they were raised in Japan. So I would use these things together. This is why intertextuality works, because you have to use multiple sources to prove one thing. Just to prove that Japanese horror, Japanese ghost stories have had an influence on Silent Hill, okay? I hope this is making sense so far. So you have the game itself, which is a primary source, and then you have things like creator comments, academic sources, outside sources, and all of these things come together to create whatever your inference is about the thing, about the game or the book or whatever. So why? Why would we want to analyze? Well, seriously, why? So analysis tones other skills. So it helps your critical thinking, it helps with argument skills, it helps with written and verbal skills. And when I say argument, I don't mean like you're going to go yell at your boyfriend or something. Argument in the sense of academia, where you're able to present facts and back them up, okay? That's what an argument is in an academic sense. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, which is, you know, basically saying that English teachers teach us to overanalyze. What the author meant, what your English teacher thinks the author meant, the curtains were blue, the curtains represent his immense depression, his lack of will to carry on. What the author meant, the curtains were fucking blue. So this is bullshit. And I'm going to tell you why it's bullshit. It's because the point of analysis is not to prove actually what the author intended. And I know that that's going to seem counterintuitive, because we just argued a lot of stuff about primary sources and about like listening to the original people and stuff. The point of analysis is to draw these connections to appreciate the work better, okay? So you're not necessarily trying to prove what's canon or what is actually intended. The point of analysis is to improve critical thinking skills. And I truly think it's things like this meme or whatever, that is why people suck at critical thinking now, because we were never taught how to do it. And the way you learn how to critically think is by, it's like a muscle. You have to tone it, you have to exercise it. And to do that, you have to do things like look at literature and figure out, what are connections to other things? Whether or not the author intended there to be these connections, your job is to just look at it and say, well, this is like this other thing. You're toning a critical thinking skill by thinking outside of what was actually given to you. So there's two things about this, two ways of literary criticism that actually support this. There is psychoanalytic literary criticism, which basically says that sometimes an author might do something in a work and they didn't even intend to do it. So, you might say like, well, clearly he's afraid of, whatever in this text. Now, the author might swear up and down that he's not, but you might pull in, let's say, an author's other works, and you'll say like, hey man, this is a theme that comes up a lot. I think you might have, I don't know, a foot fetish or whatever. And it's kind of like Quentin Tarantino. Like you might, say like, clearly this man has a thing for feet. As much as he might swear that he doesn't, you could analyze his work and say, this dude likes the feets. So that would be psychoanalytic literary criticism, where you are looking at the primary work itself, but you're going a little bit against what the author or creator actually said it represents. Then there's also biographical literary criticism, which looks at the fact that, people come from different cultures, and if something is ingrained in a culture, whether or not they acknowledge it, or even if they go against it, it still might have influenced them because they grew up in that culture. So an example of a biographical, this isn't so much culture, but this is actually a quote from one of the creators that said, most people working for game companies are game freaks, but the Silent Hill team are artists and programmers first, mainly artists. Silent Hill 2 is not a typical game because most of our staff didn't grow up playing games. Because of this, we hope to provide the gamer with a different sort of game. So this is originally the quote that made me realize that Silent Hill could be interpreted as literature and art, because the creators themselves acknowledge that. They acknowledge that it is different from other games because they were not gamers, okay? And now this isn't necessarily going against what like I said, the biographical aspect, sometimes you could go against what the author says. You have to really know what you're doing if you're going to say that. But this is just an example of a biographical that's not necessarily country culture based. So what's canon? This is an argument that has dominated conversations about Silent Hill. So these are Urban Dictionary definitions, because why the fuck not? I just wanted to what do the people think? So canon can be defined. There's a couple of definitions here. A term used especially within gaming communities to differentiate between the official storyline, canon, and everything which is not, so fan fiction, fan videos, etc. Or it can be defined as a piece of work, usually in reference to literature, that was written by the original author, spin-offs, fan fiction, and any work not written by the original author of that fictional universe is considered non-canon. Okay, so basically, what actually happens in the story and what was written by the original author. That seems pretty straightforward for like what would be considered canon, right? But gets a little wiggly because so here's like the literary definition. This is from Kip Wheeler, who was a professor of English literature at, I think, Texas A&M. So the word canon refers to the writings of an author that scholars generally accept as genuine products of said author, such as the Chaucer canon or the Shakespeare canon. Now, there's a few works that we don't know for a fact if, like, for example, Shakespeare or Chaucer wrote them, but it's generally accepted that they wrote these pieces. So it's considered the Shakespeare canon, right? So what is the Silent Hill canon? Like, what is canon for Silent Hill? Let's go deeper. Well, what happens when you're talking about a video game when there's multiple authors and multiple contributors? Then what's canon? Okay, so let's go even deeper, okay? If you have multiple people, you can have multiple opinions on what things mean in the game. So these are two different sources, two different quotes. On the left is from Owaku, which says, Sybil is not involved with Silent Hill 3. What happens to her afterwards is left up to the player's imagination. So basically, it could be anything. But then over here, you have Ito saying, yes, Sybil's dead. So these are two creators, both worked on Silent Hill, both are attributed as one of the original teams, some of the original Team Silent members, and they're saying completely opposite things here. Let's look at another example. Multiple people, multiple opinions. So Ito was saying, so somebody asked, what's beneath the Pyramid Head's helmet? He is the other James, but I think it shouldn't be clear beneath of its helmet. I don't know what he's saying there, but so I interpret this as him saying Pyramid Head looks like James under the helmet, okay? But then you have, in the making of documentary, his first idea was this creature, then he realized it was nothing more than a human in a mask. So then he took the concept further and gave the monster a head in the shape of a triangle. So that's saying that it's not a mask, it's not a helmet, it's actually his head. And then we have a quote over here about Pyramid Head, which says, one notable connection between Pyramid Head and Valtiel is the fact that they both stalk the protagonist persistently. If the helmet that conceals Pyramid Head's face were to be removed, so this is saying it is a helmet, it would become apparent that the designs of the two are surprisingly similar. When the executioner's outfit, that is Pyramid Head's, was designed, it was modeled after Valtiel, an angel from the indigenous religion. So this is saying that it is a helmet, and that if his helmet was taken off, he would look like Valtiel. So these are three completely different opinions, okay? And these are three primary sources because they were released by people that worked on Silent Hill. So, well then who's right, okay? So then we have another quote from Ito, which is a longer tweet. This is a screen grab from a long time ago. And he says, what I want to say is, those Silent Hill stories, Silent Hill 1, 2, and 3, are never made by one person. The Cage of Cradle is the story which continues to the opening of Silent Hill 1, but that story was made only by Waku and me without Silent Hill 1 story writer, Toyamo. And I don't know if he read and approved that or not, so I don't want to say clearly that's the canon. Of course, Waku and I made that as the canon. I joined only the making of Silent Hill 1, 2, and 3, so I don't know Silent Hill after Silent Hill 4, and of course Silent Hill 0. So here's Ito himself saying, when a video game is made, multiple people work on it. So you can have multiple people saying this is canon, and then other people that worked on the same game saying, I don't think that's canon. I don't think that's actually the case. So then that brings us back to our question, which is, what's canon? And the answer is, it doesn't fucking matter. It doesn't fucking matter. And that seems like bullshit to go over all that to say it doesn't matter. But remember, the point of analysis is to critically think. It's to pull things together. As long as you can prove it with supporting text, with supporting sources, you can argue whatever you want. You can go fucking nuts, okay? That's what makes analysis fun. We're not trying to prove what's canon. Obviously, you can't, just make something up and pull it out of your ass. You have to have supporting sources, and especially those primary sources. But again, I just showed multiple examples of the creators disagreeing on simple things like, is Pyramid Head's head a head or is it a helmet? We don't know. So what we would have to do is, for an example like that, is you could pull a quote of one of the creators agreeing with whichever side you're on, and then maybe pull in similar characters from other shows or games or literature and saying, well, it's kind of like this, right? So that was sort of a quick intro to video game analysis. I hope this is a good primer for analyzing video games in the future. I hope you learned something from this. I hope it was also entertaining. So yeah. So the next video you guys should be seeing from me is the first episode of Silent Hill 2 Remake. However, I am going to wait a couple of days to start recording because I'm still sick. I'm still very sick. I don't know if you can tell from my voice. But I wanted to put something out there because I'm really excited about just doing stuff again. So, until next time, bye guys.